St. Bartholomew has a smell I learned to ignore and never could. It's a mix of cheap disinfectant, old heating system air, and something I can't name but recognize as the smell of a building that was put up in 1961 and never properly cleaned since. When I came in for the 11:30 shift, that smell was stronger than usual. Maybe because the storm had forced shut the windows the cleaning crew usually leaves cracked in the back hallway. The thermostat on the second floor read 58 degrees. I logged it in the incident notebook and called maintenance, which didn't pick up. That's the routine of a Sunday night shift at Bartholomew. There were 7 of us on shift. Doug Ferris at the ER front desk, which is the entrance that matters at that hour. Patty Okafor and me in the second floor nursing unit, which has 14 beds, and that night had 9 occupied. 4 stable post-surgical patients, 2 elderly patients under observation, a woman with pneumonia who was improving slowly, and 2 others I can no longer recall clearly now, which says something about the state I'm in as I write this. Dr. Henning was on call, but Henning spends quiet shifts in the break room with the door shut and only shows up when you call him. Marcus Webb was the maintenance tech, and there was a pharmacy intern whose name I knew, but whose job that night was basically to stay near the medication room and not touch anything without asking first. 7 people, plus 9 patients. A 4-story hospital with an entire wing shut down for renovation. I was rereading the pneumonia woman's chart when I heard the wind shift outside. That's not the right word, shift, but it's the one I have. The sound went from background noise to something with volume of its own, as if the storm had decided to stop announcing itself and just arrive. The hallway window started rattling in its frame. I walked over and looked out. The parking lot was empty except for the staff cars, and the pine trees at the edge of the property were all bending in the same direction. Horizontal snow. The kind of thing that back in Portland I'd see 2 or 3 times a winter, and that here in Hatchfield seems to happen every week in January. I went back to the nursing station and called Doug. Anyone come in the last 2 hours? A woman with her son, abdominal pain. They already left, nobody before that. What's the state highway looking like? I heard him type something. Closed since 10. The municipal road too. Only 9A is still open, but the advisory says it'll get worse by 1. I thanked him and hung up. I walked to the hallway that leads to the north window, the one that faces the pine trees and the nothing beyond them, and stood there for a moment watching the snow. It wasn't exactly worry. It was more that automatic calculation you make after years in this job. If someone needs an ambulance tonight, how long will it take? If one of my patients takes a turn we can't manage here, what happens? It's not pessimism. It's just what your mind does when the world outside shuts down. At 12:45, the backup generator gave its first sign. It didn't fail, just hiccuped. The second floor lights blinked twice in a row and came back on. The Bartholomew's electrical system has its own hierarchy. The city's main grid, then the primary generator in the basement, then the backup generator for cases of double failure. The hiccup I heard wasn't from the main grid. It was the backup generator running a self-test, which is what it does automatically when it detects instability on the line. I know this because Marcus explained it to me once months back, after a shift where the lights flickered for 40 minutes, and I sent 3 messages to administration without a response. I texted Marcus. He replied, "In the basement, already saw it, looks okay for now." Patty appeared in the station doorway holding a cup of coffee and wearing the look of someone who'd already run the same calculations I had. "It's going to be a long night," she said. "Could be. Does Henning know he's here?" "He knows he's on call. Whether he knows he's actually here, I'm not sure." She let out a short laugh and headed back down the hall. I finished the coffee in my mug, which was cold, and started the second round of the night. Every room, every patient. The pneumonia woman was sleeping with her mouth slightly open, and the pulse oximeter reading 93, which was low enough for me to adjust the oxygen flow, but not low enough to wake Henning. The post-surgical patients were stable. The 2 elderly patients were asleep. Everything within what you'd expect from a Sunday night shift. In the back hallway, near the stairwell that leads down to the first floor, there was a puddle of water. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a meal tray, but it was sitting in the middle of the gray linoleum corridor with no visible explanation. I looked up. The ceiling was intact. No moisture stain. I looked both ways. No open door, no bucket, no broken window. I grabbed the mop from the supply closet, pushed the water to the side, set down a wet floor sign left over from some old renovation, and logged it in the notebook. Possible leak, north hallway, second floor. Check with maintenance. That was the strangest thing that happened until 2 in the morning. After that, everything changed all at once. Doug called at 2:03. I was at the nursing station rereading a note I'd written wrong when the phone rang, and from the tone of his voice I already knew it wasn't a routine call. "Rachel, I need you down here. Now." "What happened?" "A guy. 2 men brought him in on foot. They were coming back from Deering on 9A. Found him on the side of the road. General condition? Bad, probable hypothermia, cuts on his arms, barely any clothes on. But Rachel..." He paused in a way that wasn't Doug's way of pausing, because Doug normally doesn't pause. He's acting really strange. I took the stairs because the elevator takes forever at that hour, and I didn't want to wait. The Bartholomew ER is a large room divided by faded blue curtains, with 4 gurneys and a central station where Doug spends the night. When I came in through the side door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the hospital's usual smell. Something underneath it, wet and dense, like damp earth mixed with blood. The second thing was the sound. Loud, uneven breathing coming from the second gurney on the left. The 2 men who had brought him in were leaning against the back wall in snow jackets that were still wet. One of them had a cut on his right hand that he was holding with a folded cloth. The other was staring at the gurney like he hadn't decided yet whether to stay or run. I went to the gurney. The man was maybe 40, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because his condition scrambled any attempt at reading his age. He was wearing torn jeans and nothing else. Bare feet, purple from the cold. The cuts on his arms were deep and long, the kind that bleed slowly but don't stop on their own. There was dried blood on the side of his neck and on his scalp, and his skin had that specific shade you see in someone who's been exposed for too long, grayish-white at the extremities, red patches on the chest. The breathing was what bothered me most. Too fast, but not the way someone in a panic breathes, the way someone in distress breathes, like breathing was costing him something. I put 2 fingers on his wrist. Heart rate was elevated. I grabbed the ear thermometer, 106.9. "I need Dr. Henning," I said to Doug without taking my eyes off the patient. "Already called him. He's on his way." I started the assessment while I waited. I tried to check his pupils with the penlight. That's when the man turned his head in my direction, too fast for someone in that condition, and looked at me in a way that wasn't exactly looking at me. It was more like detecting. His eyes were open, the irises so dilated you could barely make out the color, and he didn't blink. "Can you hear me? What's your name?" Nothing. The breathing kept its rhythm. "You're in the hospital. You're safe. I need to check your injuries." He turned his head back toward the ceiling as if I had stopped being relevant. Henning arrived 2 minutes later, hair flattened from a pillow and wearing the expression of someone who needs context before he can function. I ran through the case in 30 seconds. Probable hypothermia, fever of 106.9, cuts on his arms, altered mental status, possibly intoxication or a psychotic episode. Henning examined him, agreed on the hypothermia, ordered labs, told us to prep a mild sedative and warmed IV fluids. That's when we tried to get the IV line in and everything fell apart. I had the tourniquet on his left arm and was looking for a vein when he moved. It wasn't a spasm, wasn't the kind of involuntary resistance you see in confused or pain-stricken patients. It was deliberate and fast. He grabbed my wrist with his right hand and squeezed with a strength that had no explanation within the clinical picture I had in my head. 106-degree fever, hypothermia, blood loss. That's not the patient who snaps your wrist if he wants to. He didn't snap it, but it hurt enough for me to drop everything I was holding. Doug came running in. Henning stepped back. The man sat up on the gurney in a motion that shouldn't have been possible for someone who 2 minutes earlier could barely hold his head up. He sat there scanning the whole room, his breathing louder now, and made a sound I still can't describe with any precision. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't any recognizable human vocalization. It was something guttural and long that came out of his chest and filled the entire room. One of the men against the back wall opened the door and walked out into the snow without a word. Henning tried to approach with the syringe. The patient threw himself to the opposite side of the gurney, got to his feet, and for a second stood motionless in the middle of the room with the IV dripping on the floor and the cuts on his arms running again. He was tall, taller than I'd estimated with him lying down. And there was something about his posture that wasn't the posture of someone disoriented. It was the posture of someone taking stock of his surroundings. Then he was gone. Not slowly, not stumbling. He went through the side door that opens into the back hallway, the same one I'd come in through, and the sound of bare feet on linoleum disappeared faster than his condition had any right to allow. Doug went after him and came back 30 seconds later. He went into the north wing. The access door was unlocked. The renovation crew must have forgotten. The north wing is at the far end of the first floor and has no working cameras because the cameras were uninstalled before the renovation began and nobody has put them back yet. It has 40 meters of hallway, 12 empty rooms, a service stairwell, and no exterior exit that doesn't require a key. He won't get far in that condition, Henning said. I'm calling the Hatchfield police. I radioed Marcus on the internal line and asked him to lock the access door to the north wing from our side. Marcus didn't answer. I tried Marcus 3 times on the radio and twice on my cell. On the third cell attempt, it went straight to voicemail, which meant the phone was either off or had no signal. And Bartholomew has bad reception in the basement, always has. It's one of the complaints the maintenance crew repeats at every meeting, and that administration writes down and forgets. I went down to the basement door, knocked, waited. Nothing. The door was locked from the inside, which was the correct procedure for the night shift, but there was no light visible through the gap at the bottom. I went back to the ER. Henning was on the phone with the Hatchfield police. I heard enough to understand that the situation there was 1 car and 2 officers available, roads closed, and a promise to try to get there once the blizzard let up. The man who had stayed, the one with the cut on his hand, was sitting in a plastic chair with the cloth still wrapped around his fingers, staring at the floor. Doug was at the central station pretending to fill something out, but really just waiting for someone to give him a direction. Police are already called, I said to Doug. Come upstairs with me to the 2nd floor and move the patient behind curtain 3 into one of the rooms with a door. The post-surgical? He's stable and he's 62 years old, and if that man shows up again, I don't want him on a gurney separated by a fabric curtain. Doug went. I followed but stopped in the hallway connecting the ER to the rest of the 1st floor. The smell was different. Not the blood smell from the patient's cuts, which I'd already identified in the emergency room. It was something else, deeper, more animal, the kind of smell that makes the back of your brain react before the front part understands why. Like wet fur, like something large that had been sitting still in an enclosed space for too long. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, just breathing. Then I kept walking. On the 2nd floor, Patty had already heard part of what happened over the intercom and had the patients checked and the room doors closed. I filled her in on the rest in 2 minutes in the hallway, keeping my voice low. She listened without interrupting, which was typical of Patty. She processes first, asks questions later. You think he'll come up here? I don't know. The north wing has a service stairwell that connects to the 2nd floor through the back entrance. Does that door have a lock? It does. I have the spare on my keyring. Lock it. She went. I went to check on the patients. The woman with pneumonia was awake and asked what was going on because she'd heard noise from downstairs. I told her it was an agitated patient who had already been restrained, that everything was fine, that she needed to rest. She looked at me the way people look when they know they're getting the edited version, but don't have the energy to push back. I adjusted her blanket and closed the door. That's when I heard the noise in the back hallway. It was a dull thudding sound, the kind a door makes when something pushes from the other side with weight but no speed. Once. Pause. Again. I came down the hallway slowly, passing the closed rooms. The sound was coming from the service stairwell access door, the same one Patty had gone to lock. The door was closed, but there was a new mark in the wood at mid-height, as if something had pressed from the inside outward. And under the door, in the narrow gap between the wood and the linoleum, there was a dark, wet stain that was slowly spreading in the direction of my shoe. I stepped back 2 paces. I called Patty on the radio. "Where are you?" "Nursing station." "Why?" "Did you lock the service stairwell door?" I went down there, but the door was already open. I locked it and came back. "About 4 minutes ago. Already open." The door was already open when Patty got there, which meant Marcus had been there, or that someone had been there before Marcus, or in Marcus's place. I went back down to the first floor. I walked to the basement door, and this time I didn't knock. I pressed my ear against the wood and stayed still. For a moment I heard nothing beyond the generator, which ran in a constant low rumble I'd learned to tune out. Then I heard something else. It wasn't Marcus walking, wasn't the sound of tools or equipment. It was a heavy, uneven dragging, the kind of sound you hear and can't fit into any familiar category because there is no category for it. I stepped away from the door. I went back to the ER. The man with the cut on his hand was gone. The plastic chair was empty and the front door had its rubber stopper wedged in place, blowing cold, snowy air inside. I hadn't seen him leave. Doug hadn't either. "Did you get a hold of Marcus?" I asked. "No, but the basement light is on. You can see it through the small window on the outside." "Is that window reachable with all this snow?" "If you go around through the back parking lot, yeah." I looked at Doug for a second. He was 20 years younger than me, broad-shouldered with the expression of someone who wants to help, but doesn't know what he's volunteering for. "You're not going outside," I said. "Nobody goes outside while the storm is like this." "What about Marcus?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer that worked. I grabbed the radio and tried Marcus one more time. The static lasted 3 seconds and then the channel went silent. Not the silence of a bad signal, which has its own texture. Clean silence, like the device on the other end had ceased to exist. The wet fur smell was stronger in the hallway. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus wasn't going to answer again. The decision to go into the north wing wasn't brave. It was the absence of any other option with a name. Marcus was missing. The police weren't going to arrive before sunrise in the best-case scenario. Henning had gone back to the break room after calling administration and reaching nobody. And I had a second floor with 9 patients and 2 nurses to cover a building that clearly had something wrong inside it. I needed to know what that something was. I needed information before I could keep making decisions in the dark. I grabbed the large flashlight from the emergency supply cabinet, the pepper spray I've carried in my bag since Portland out of old habit, and told Patty where I was going and to call me on the radio if anything changed on the second floor. "You shouldn't go alone," she said. "Should you come with me and leave the patients?" She stayed. I went. The access door to the north wing is at the far end of the first floor, past the radiology hallway, and the records room nobody has used since they digitized the charts. It's a metal door with a horizontal push bar, the kind that locks automatically from the outside but opens from the inside without a key. The renovation had started from the back of the wing and was working its way toward the entrance, which in practice meant the first few rooms past the door still had equipment pushed against the walls and plastic sheeting covering the floors, while the rooms farther back were completely stripped, walls open, wiring exposed. I pushed the bar and went in. The smell hit before anything else. It was the same smell from the second-floor hallway, the same one I'd picked up in the ER and hadn't been able to name precisely. But here it was concentrated, dense, almost textured. Wet fur and blood and something else underneath both of those. Something I now associate with a large animal in an enclosed space, but which in that moment my brain simply refused to file under any known category. I swept the flashlight across both sides as I moved. In the third room on the left, the construction plastic on the floor had been torn and shoved into the corners as if something had thrashed around on top of it. There were bare footprints in the drywall dust covering the linoleum. Human prints, large, going into the room and not coming back out. In the center of the room, where the footprints ended, there were clothes. The torn jeans. In two pieces, not like when you rip fabric with your hands. Like when something bursts open from the inside out, force applied in a way the material can't keep up with. The waistband still fastened, the button still in place, and the right leg split down the middle of its length in an uneven line that wasn't a cut. It was a shredding. Next to them, smaller fragments of something I looked at twice before understanding it was the elastic waistband of a pair of underwear. I stood in the doorway staring at that for longer than I should have. The pepper spray was in my right hand, and I hadn't noticed when I'd put it there. I continued down the hallway. The marks started about 4 meters past the room. They were gouges in the linoleum, deep in groups of 4 or 5 running parallel, spaced irregularly as if something had been walking and its claws had scraped the floor with each stride. I followed the marks with the flashlight. They led toward the back of the wing, where the rooms were darker and the hallway bent left toward the service stairwell. I stopped at the bend in the hallway. I took one breath. I turned the corner. It was about 40 feet from me, facing away, standing still in the middle of the hallway near the stairwell door. The flashlight caught its back first, and what I saw didn't fit what I'd expected to see. Didn't fit any rational continuation of the story I'd been telling myself about a patient in a psychotic break, or severe hypothermia, or any combination of bad things that were still human. It was too tall. Shoulders too wide, the spine long and slightly pitched forward, arms hanging past where arms should hang. There was fur. Not fuzz, not fine hair. Thick and dark and uneven, shorter across the back, longer on the shoulders and forearms, and the legs had a joint in the middle that was not a knee. It turned its head toward the light. The snout was long. The eyes caught the flashlight beam and reflected for a fraction of a second before I lowered the angle by instinct, and what stayed on my retina was that reflection and the line of teeth that its expression, if that's what it was, left partially visible. I knew immediately what I was looking at. It wasn't a conclusion, wasn't reasoning. It was direct recognition, the kind that happens before any word. But the word came right after, because that's how my mind works. That's how I stay on my feet when everything else fails. I name it, I classify it, I put a label on the problem and keep moving. Werewolf. I stepped back one pace, then another. Slowly, not taking the flashlight completely off it but not pointing it directly at the eyes again. It stayed still for those 2 seconds, head tilted slightly to one side, its breathing audible now. That same loud, heavy rhythm from the ER, but bigger, deeper, coming from a chest that was nearly twice the size as before. I reached the bend in the hallway and turned. I ran. I didn't look back. I heard it, the sound of heavy weight moving behind me, claws on linoleum and a low guttural sound that wasn't a howl, wasn't a growl, was something between the two that I will never be able to describe in a way that makes sense to anyone who hasn't heard it. I pushed the metal door's bar, stepped out into the main hallway, let the door slam behind me. From the other side, silence. I stood with my back against the wall next to the door for about 20 seconds, breathing. Then I grabbed the radio. "Patty, lock everything that has a key on the 2nd floor, everything." "What happened?" "Lock first. I'll explain when I get up there." I took the stairs instead of the elevator, not out of caution, but because my body just went to the stairs, and I only realized I was climbing when I was already on the 2nd step. My legs were working. The rest of me was doing something that wasn't quite thinking, more like processing, the way you do when you take a hit and need a few seconds before the pain actually registers. I had seen the clothes torn from the inside out. I had seen the gouges in the linoleum and the height and the fur and the wrong joint in the middle of the leg. I had heard that sound, and my mind was trying to find some drawer to stuff all of it into, some clinical category or explanation that would turn what I'd seen into something manageable. It didn't find one. What I had seen was what it was, and I needed to keep moving regardless of any conclusion. Patty was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, with the 2nd floor key in her hand, and an expression that shifted when she saw me up close. "Rachel, I'm fine. You're not fine. I'm functional, which is what matters right now." I moved past her toward the nursing station. "Where's the intern?" "Medication room." "Henning?" "Break room. I tried to get him after you called. He didn't open the door. I went to the break room and knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. "Dr. Henning." I heard movement, the creak of a hospital cot, footsteps. The door opened. Henning was in a wrinkled lab coat with his glasses in his hand, and I didn't give him time to ask what was going on. "I need you to listen to what I'm about to say without interrupting. Then you can decide what you think," I told him. 2 minutes, no qualifications, no softening of what I'd seen. Henning listened with the expression of someone trying to find the most reasonable interpretation for a series of facts that have no reasonable interpretation. When I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. "You're describing a werewolf," he said. "I'm describing what I saw. Rachel, severe hypothermia combined with a fever of that magnitude can cause— I know what hypothermia causes. I saw what I saw." I stopped, breathed. "I don't need you to believe me right now. I need you to treat this as a real threat and help me protect the patients. Can you do that?" He put his glasses on. "Yes." Henning and I went downstairs together to the first floor and went to find Doug. The ER was empty and silent, the front door shut with the rubber stopper removed, snow building up on the threshold outside. Doug was at the central station with the radio in his hand, and when he saw us standing in the doorway, I knew from the way he looked at us that something had changed. "The fire door in the east hallway," he said. "It closed on its own about 10 minutes ago. The system triggered, I don't know why, and now it won't open from the panel. The east hallway connected the ER to the first floor inpatient wing. If the door had locked, any patient on the first floor was cut off from us without direct communication. Are there patients on the first floor? No. That floor was empty tonight. Everyone moved up. So the locked door cuts us off from what? The emergency pharmacy, the X-ray room, and the east service stairwell. The east service stairwell. The same one that connected to the north wing through the basement. Are the elevators working?" Doug tried the panel. Both arrows lit up, blinked once, and went dark. "Not anymore." The three of us stood looking at the dead panel for a moment. Henning spoke first. "We need to go up and stay on the second floor. Patients, staff, everyone in one space, doors locked, and we wait until the police can get through." It was the right plan. It was the only plan that made sense. I went upstairs with Henning and Doug. We locked the stairwell door from the inside with the slide bolt that had always been there, but that I'd never used. And I did a head count. Patty, the pharmacy intern whose name I now knew was Cora. Henning, Doug, me. 5. Plus 9 patients, 3 of whom could move without assistance and 6 who couldn't. 14 people on a hospital's second floor with 1 access stairwell, 1 service door locked by Patty, and the elevators dead. "Is there another way out of this floor?" Doug asked. "The exterior fire escape," Patty said. "But the access window is in the north hallway, and with this temperature, nobody's going down the fire escape in below freezing weather with 6 patients who can't walk," I cut in. "That's a last resort. Dead last." I assigned roles. Patty stayed with the patients, checks every 15 minutes. Cora stayed at the nursing station, no walking the hallways alone. Henning in the exam room, which had 2 solid walls and a table that could be wedged against the door. Doug with me. We did a quick sweep of the floor. Everything locked, everything quiet. The smell I'd encountered in the north wing wasn't present here. Just the usual Bartholomew smell, disinfectant and stale air. For about 20 minutes, I thought the second floor was in fact separated enough. It was Doug who saw it first. We were in the central hallway when he stopped and pointed upward without saying anything. In the drop ceiling above us, about 6 feet overhead, there was a ventilation grate. It looked like every other grate in the building. White plastic screwed into its frame, about a foot square. Except this one was slightly out of place. Not much. Just enough to show a dark gap of about an inch on the right side where white plastic had previously sat flush against white plaster. I stared at that gap. From inside the duct came no sound at all, but the smell arrived a second later. Faint, almost imperceptible, mixed in with the heating system air, wet fur, blood. Something that was large and close and had been in that duct before we came upstairs, or while we were coming upstairs, and this was the possibility I needed to stop considering if I wanted to keep functioning. Right now. "Go back to the station," I said to Doug in a low voice. Don't run, walk normal. Rachel, walk normal. We walked. The first thing I did when we got back to the station was grab the building map. There was a laminated copy in the emergency binder, alongside the evacuation protocols we review once a year in a meeting nobody takes seriously. I spread it open on the counter and studied the second-floor layout by flashlight, because the station lighting was dim, the backup generator holding the minimum, the fluorescent lights running at half capacity. Bartholomew's ventilation system had been designed in the 70s and half-renovated in the 90s. The main ducts ran in the space between the drop ceiling and the concrete slab, connecting all floors through a central shaft in the building's core. There was a maintenance access point on the third floor, which was empty, and air vents in every hallway on every floor. The interior width of the main ducts was between 24 and 32 inches. 32 inches. I looked at Doug. He was looking at the map too, and reached the same conclusion at the same time I did. He fits, Doug said. Folded, but he fits. Patty appeared in the station doorway. The patients are... She stopped when she saw our faces. What is it? I showed her the map, explained it in under a minute. Patty listened, looked up at the hallway ceiling as if trying to calculate how many ventilation grates there were between her and the patient rooms, then looked back at me. I need something to lock the grates from inside. They're screwed in plastic. You can't lock them. You either remove them or you leave them. Then we remove them. We spent the next 20 minutes taking down every ventilation grate we could reach with a chair and a screwdriver Doug found in the station's tool drawer. We stacked the grates in the hallway. Without the grate, the duct opening was exposed, but an exposed opening you can see is better than a displaced grate you didn't notice. If something came through, at least it wouldn't be a surprise. It was during this that Cora appeared. She was 17 or 18, 3 weeks into her pharmacy internship, and until that night the longest conversation we'd had was about where the second-floor bathroom was. She came into the hallway in a lab coat 3 sizes too big for her, and asked if she could help, and I said yes and put her holding the chair steady while Doug and I took turns with the screwdriver. On the fourth one, while Doug was up on the chair removing the second-to-last grate in the south hallway, we heard it. It was different from before. Different from the dull thudding against the service stairwell door. Different from the heavy dragging I'd heard at the basement door. It was a sound of continuous movement inside the ceiling, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the north hallway and shifting toward the central hallway. Like someone lying flat and pulling their own weight through a small space, except the weight was large and the space clearly too small for whatever was occupying it. Cora gripped the chair with both hands. "Get down," I said to Doug in a low voice. He climbed down without making a sound. The 3 of us stood in the hallway listening to the sound move. It passed the point where we were standing. I could hear the duct metal giving slightly under the weight, and continued toward the east hallway, where 2 of the post-surgical patients' rooms were. I went. The others followed. I went into the first post-surgical room, woke the patient with a hand on his shoulder and 2 fingers in front of my lips before he could speak. 62-year-old man, gallbladder removed 2 days prior, reasonable mobility. He understood the signal and stayed quiet. I helped him up, got his arm over my shoulder, and we moved down the hallway to the exam room where Henning was waiting. It had the thickest walls on the floor and the only door with a slide bolt besides the stairwell. We did that 3 times for the patients who could move with assistance. The other 6 stayed in their rooms with doors closed and Patty moving between them. It was a bad solution, and I knew it. But moving bedridden patients through the hallway with that sound shifting overhead was a worse one. The sound stopped for about 15 minutes. I was in the hallway checking the rooms when it started again. But this time it wasn't in the ceiling. It was in the north hallway wall at floor level. A long, slow scraping, like claws testing the surface. It stopped. Started again 2 meters farther along. Stopped again. The north hallway wall was the wall separating the hallway from the building's exterior. On the other side of that wall was the metal fire escape bolted to the facade, running down to ground level. I went to the fire escape access window at the end of the north hallway and looked through the glass. There were marks on the fire escape's metal grating. Not on the upper sections, on the second landing grating, level with the second floor. The metal was bent inward at 2 points. The bars deformed as if something had grabbed from the outside and pulled to test the resistance. The snow on the steps showed marks that the wind was already erasing, but that for a few seconds were still clear enough for me to understand what they had been. The werewolf had exited the building at some point, had gone around the outside of the facade, and had tried to get back in through the fire escape. I stepped back from the window and went straight to the exam room. Henning was standing near the table, the 3 mobile patients sitting in chairs around him. I closed the door behind me. "The fire escape is no longer an option," I said. Henning didn't say anything when I closed the door. None of the 3 patients said anything. The gallbladder man looked at me with an expression I recognized from years in the ICU. The expression of someone who has already understood that the situation is serious and decided to trust whoever is standing in front of them, because the alternative is to panic, and panicking hurts. I went to the nursing station to get Cora and brought her back to the exam room. 7 people in a 12 by 16 room with a gurney, 3 chairs, 2 stools, and the exam table Doug had wedged against the door. Patty was still in the hallway with the bedridden patients. I needed someone out there, and Patty was the right person. She didn't panic, didn't make impulsive decisions, knew what to do if any of the monitors started alarming. I spent the next hour at the exam room door, going back and forth between the 2 spaces, checking on Patty, checking the hallway, listening to the ceiling. The werewolf moved in cycles. It would go quiet for a stretch, 15, 20 minutes, and then start again, always along a slightly different path than before, as if it were mapping. It had stopped scraping the exterior wall. It had gone back into the ductwork at some point I hadn't heard, maybe through the 3rd floor maintenance access, maybe through some opening I hadn't identified. The sound was still the only information I had about where it was. At 4 in the morning, Doug asked to use the bathroom. The men's room was in the central hallway, about 40 feet from the exam room. I knew that. He knew that. "Use the sink in here," I said. "Rachel, Doug." He used the sink. Nobody commented. At 4:20, the generator hiccuped again. This time, the lights didn't come back right away. They stayed off for nearly 10 seconds before returning, dimmer than before, with that yellowish tint of insufficient power that makes everything look older and dirtier. One of the patients in the exam room started praying quietly. It wasn't something that would have bothered me under normal circumstances, but in that silence, the murmuring had a weight I had to actively ignore. Henning came up beside me near the door. "How long can the backup generator hold?" Marcus used to say it had fuel for 8 hours at reduced load, but the load isn't reduced. It's at the limit, so less. Probably less. He nodded and went back to his corner. I appreciated that he didn't ask what would happen when the fuel ran out, because I didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud. At 4:45, I realized Cora wasn't in the room. I counted twice because I didn't want to be right. Henning, Doug, 3 patients, me, 6. Cora was the 7th and she wasn't there. "How long ago did she leave?" I asked Doug. He looked around as if he expected to find her in a corner. I didn't see her leave. Nobody had. Nobody had heard the table move, the door open, footsteps, or they had heard it and assumed it was me going to check on Patty. The room was too dark and too full of people who were too tense for anyone to have noticed an 18-year-old intern deciding to do something on her own. I went into the hallway with the flashlight. "Cora." Silence. "Cora, answer me." Patty appeared in the doorway of the nearest room. I signaled for her to stay put and moved down the central hallway toward the nursing station. The station chair was empty. The emergency pharmacy, the small one on the 2nd floor for immediate use, had its door ajar. I went in. Cora was facing away from me, pulling open drawers. When she heard my footsteps, she spun around fast with a vial in her hand, and it took me a second to identify what it was: ketamine veterinary dosage, which Bartholomew kept for emergency procedures, and which lived in the 2nd level of the 2nd drawer because I had organized that drawer myself 6 months ago. "If I inject this into him," she started. "No. Just listen, if the dose is high enough." "Cora." I stepped in another pace. "You are barefoot in the hallway at 4 in the morning with a vial of ketamine and a plan to inject anesthetic into a werewolf. Do me a favor and listen to the sentence you just were." She lowered the vial. I saw the exact moment the plan collapsed inside her head. Not all at once, but in layers. The way it happens when you realize you were convinced of something that doesn't make sense and can't pinpoint exactly when it stopped making sense. "I just wanted to do something," she said. Her voice was 18 years old. Completely 18. "I know." I took the vial from her hand. Wanting to do something is the right instinct. The plan was bad. "You need to be in the room with the others." She went. I stayed in the pharmacy for a moment, looking at the vial in my hand, then moved to put it away, and stopped. The hallway to the left of the pharmacy led to the north hallway, and the north hallway was dark because that section had lost power before the others. But in the dark, there was something that shouldn't have been there. About 25 feet away from me, standing in the middle of the hallway with its head slightly lowered to avoid the ceiling, the werewolf was looking at me. It wasn't moving. It wasn't advancing. It was standing with that specific stillness I had seen in the north wing. The kind of stillness that isn't an absence of intention. It's a concentration of it. The breathing was audible from that distance. Shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that wasn't human. Slower, deeper. The chest expanding more than a human chest expands. I stepped back 1 pace, then 2. It didn't move. I backed up to the pharmacy doorway, came out through the central hallway without running, went into the exam room and wedged the table back against the door. Doug looked at me. "It's in the north hallway," I said quietly, standing still. "Why is it standing still?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. But I kept thinking about it for the next 20 minutes as we all sat quiet in the dark room, listening to the generator working slower and slower. A predator that stops, that stands motionless in the hallway when it could have moved forward. It was waiting for something. I didn't know what, and that was the part that chilled me more than anything else that night. The main generator died at 5:11 in the morning. It wasn't gradual. It was a dry, mechanical crack from the basement, like something striking a thick pipe, and then silence where there had been rumbling. The second-floor lights went completely dark for a few seconds before the backup generator kicked in. And when it did, what stayed lit was so little that it took me a moment to understand the lights were actually on. 1 emergency light in the ceiling of each hallway, its own battery, 4 hours of backup power. The exam room went pitch black. I heard breathing quicken around me. I handed out the 2 flashlights we had. I kept the smaller one. "Are the monitors still working for the bedridden patients?" Henning asked. "The ones with internal batteries, yes. For how long, I don't know." I went out into the hallway. The north hallway was dark beyond the reach of the emergency light, which was mounted in the central hallway and cast a faint yellowish glow that carried about 20 feet before dissolving into black. I went to Patty. She was in the pneumonia woman's room, sitting in the chair beside the bed, and when I came in, she held up 2 fingers. Our shift signal, meaning stable, everything within expectations. But her eyes said something else. "Her pulse ox is at 90, she said quietly. "Without main power, the oxygen flow dropped. How much is left in the portable tank?" I changed it at 11. "There's plenty left. Switch her over to the portable." Patty was already doing it while I was still talking. We worked in silence for a few minutes, and once the patient was stable on the portable tank, I went to check the other rooms. The 2 elderly patients were sleeping with their monitors flashing red from the power drop, but the numbers were acceptable. The post-surgical patients who had stayed in their rooms were awake and quiet. One of them, a woman around 50 who had come in Thursday to have a benign nodule removed, was sitting up in bed with the blanket over her shoulders and the composed expression of someone who had decided not to waste energy on what she couldn't control. "Is everything going to be okay?" she asked me. "I'm working on it," I said. It was the most honest answer I had. I went back to the central hallway and stopped. The emergency light in the north hallway had gone out. It shouldn't have gone out. Its own battery, 4 hours of backup power, less than an hour of use. I went to the spot where it was mounted in the ceiling and aimed my flashlight at it. The bulb was intact. The plastic housing was intact. But there was a mark in the ceiling around the fixture, a circular dent in the drop ceiling tile, as if something had pressed down from above with enough weight to shift the tile and knock the bulb loose from its socket. I stared at the ceiling longer than I should have. Then I heard Doug yelling, I came through the central hallway toward the exam room. The table had been shoved aside, not knocked over, just moved, and the door was open. Doug was in the hallway outside with the large flashlight aimed at the far end of the east hallway, and next to him Henning was holding the arm of one of the post-surgical patients who was trying to pull free. He heard something in his room and went to check on his own, Doug said without taking his eyes off the hallway. He was out before I could. Where's his room? East hallway, second room. The east hallway was dark. The emergency light in that hallway was out too. I took Doug's flashlight and went. The second room in the east hallway had its door open. I went in with the flashlight sweeping the space. The empty bed with the sheets thrown back, the monitor off, the window intact, the bathroom door ajar. I went to the bathroom and opened it. Empty. I went back into the room, and that's when the flashlight caught the floor on the far side of the bed. The side against the wall, the side I hadn't seen from the doorway. I won't describe what was there. Not because I can't, but because it serves no purpose. What matters is that it was the maintenance tech. It was Marcus, and he was on the second floor when he should have been in the basement, which meant the werewolf had brought him up or come up after him, or in some combination I couldn't reconstruct, and that didn't change anything practical either way. I closed the bathroom and left the room. I walked back down the hallway to Doug and Henning. I didn't run. I did the same thing I'd asked Doug to do 2 hours earlier. Walked normal, controlled my breathing, reached them and spoke quietly. Bring everyone here, all the patients who can walk, everyone from the exam room, central hallway, under the emergency light that's still on. Why the hallway? Henning asked. Because it's the only point on this floor with guaranteed light and sightlines in both directions. If something comes, we see it before it reaches us. Doug went to get the people from the exam room. Henning went back with the patient who had tried to go off on his own, and returned 2 minutes later with him, and 2 more of the bedridden patients who could sit up and walk with support. Patty arrived with the oxygen woman in a wheelchair she'd found in the hallway. We huddled together under the emergency light. 10 people in a hospital hallway at 5 in the morning, most of them in hospital gowns, all of them alternating their gaze between both ends of the hallway without having agreed to do so. Cora was sitting on the floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. The north hallway was completely dark. The east hallway was completely dark. The south hallway still had its emergency light on, but it flickered once while I was looking at it, and I mentally tallied how many lights had gone out ahead of schedule, and concluded it wasn't a malfunction, wasn't a weak battery. It was the werewolf learning that light and dark made a difference to the prey inside the building. That conclusion unsettled me more than anything else that night, including what I had found in the east hallway room. Because a predator that learns that isn't just instinct. It's something I had no name for, and that didn't need a name to be lethal. Rachel. It was Doug, low voice. He was looking at the south hallway. The light. I looked. It had gone out. We were in complete darkness for maybe 3 seconds before I turned on the flashlight. 3 seconds is enough time for 10 people to produce 10 different reactions. I heard breath caught, heard someone murmuring, heard the creak of the wheelchair being turned without direction. The flashlight cut through the dark and the hallway was empty in both directions. But empty didn't mean anything at that point in the night. Empty just meant the flashlight didn't reach far enough. Or 3, I said. It was the only option that still made sense. Or 3 was in the middle of the central hallway, had concrete walls from the 60s that were neither drywall nor plaster, had a reinforced glass door with a metal frame and an internal lever lock, and had the only emergency lighting setup on the second floor that ran on a separate circuit. Powered by a UPS battery the hospital had installed years ago to protect surgical equipment from power outages. I knew this because I had complained once that the surgical circuit had priority over the hallways, and Marcus had explained the system's logic to me with the patience of someone who had explained the same thing many times before. We moved down the central hallway with the flashlight on, me in front, Doug behind, covering what I couldn't see. Patty pushed the wheelchair. Henning guided 2 patients by the arm. Cora came in the middle of the group with the woman and the one of the 2 elderly patients who could still walk. Or 3 was on the right side, 8th door. I opened the lock, pushed through, hit the UPS switch on the side wall. The ceiling lights came on with that white, cold surgical room brightness that is never comfortable, but which in that moment felt like the most solid thing I'd seen in hours. We went in. I was last, and I closed the door. The lever lock clicked into place. I counted. 10 people, including me. Patty, Doug, Henning, Cora, and 6 patients in varying degrees of mobility and awareness of what was happening. The woman with the oxygen tank was positioned near the wall's central oxygen outlet. The gas system still worked because it ran on mechanical pressure, independent of electrical power. The other patients were settled as best we could manage. 2 on the surgical table, 2 in the procedure chairs, 1 on the floor with blankets Patty had brought. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Henning stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching the hallway through the glass. Doug sat on the floor with his back against the wall and closed his eyes, not sleeping, just conserving. Cora stayed beside Patty helping with the patients, and I noticed she was better when she had something to do with her hands. I kept moving, checking the patients, checking the door, checking the panels on the wall. The OR had an internal intercom connected to the ER front desk, which was unmanned, and a landline phone that depended on the external line, which was dead. There was a locked surgical supply cabinet whose key wasn't on Patty's ring or mine. There was an instrument tray covered by a green surgical drape that some tech had left prepped before the end of the previous shift. Scalpels, clamps, scissors, retractors. I took the heaviest Mayo scissors from the tray and put them in my lab coat pocket. They weren't going to do anything against the werewolf. I knew that. But having something in your hand is different from having nothing, and I wasn't in a position to be rigorous about the logic of my choices. At 5:40, Henning stepped back from the door. "Rachel." His tone was enough. I went to the door and looked into the hallway. The werewolf was in the central hallway. It was about 50 feet from the room, standing still beneath the only remaining light in the hallway. The central hallway emergency light that was still on because it was directly above the path we'd taken to get here, and which was still working maybe because it hadn't passed that way yet, or maybe because it wanted it working. The light fell over it from above and from the sides, and for the first time I was seeing it without fragmentation, without distance, without the mediation of panic and running. It was larger than I'd estimated. Its shoulders nearly touched both walls of the hallway when it turned to face the door. They didn't quite, but nearly, and the hallway was 6 feet wide. The fur on its chest was denser than on its back, darker, and its arms hung long and slightly curved with hands that had fingers, that ended in claws I could hear scraping the linoleum when it took a step. The head was large and long, ears pitched forward, and the snout was slightly open, showing the lower teeth, which were white and long and had nothing human in their proportions. It was looking at me, not looking at the room. Looking at me specifically, with that concentration I had seen in the ER, when it was still partially human, and which was now amplified by a body built entirely for it. Nobody in the room said anything. It walked, slowly, upright, with a heavy tread I could hear through the glass and the concrete, and feel faintly through the soles of my shoes. It stopped 1 meter from the door. Its breathing fogged the glass in a circular patch that appeared and disappeared with its rhythm. Patty put her hand on my arm. It lowered its head to door level and looked inside the room, not from a distance, up close, the snout inches from the glass, and the eyes caught the white light of the surgical fixtures and reflected for a fraction of a second before it readjusted its angle. Then it placed its hand on the door. It didn't knock, didn't push. It placed its palm, too large, the fingers spreading beyond the limits of what a human hand spreads, and pressed slowly against the glass. The glass didn't give. It held the pressure for about 3 seconds, testing the resistance, calculating. I stepped back involuntarily. Behind me I heard Cora hold her breath. The werewolf pulled its hand from the glass and stood motionless for a moment. Then it looked to the side, at the wall beside the door, and did something I didn't expect. It struck once, hard, at the point where the door's metal frame met the concrete wall. The impact was loud enough to make one of the patients cry out. The frame didn't give, but I heard the lock fitting vibrate. It was testing where the door was weakest. I looked at Doug. Doug was on his feet. I looked around the room, at the walls, at the panels, at the locked cabinet, at the instrument tray, at the oxygen tank on the wall, at the oxygen tank. I went to Patty and spoke in her ear, low. Outside, the werewolf struck the frame again. The plan was simple because simple was the only kind of plan I was capable of executing. The portable oxygen tank Patty had brought into the room was an E-cylinder. 2,000 pounds per square inch of pressure inside a half-meter aluminum cylinder. If I opened the regulator all the way and removed the outlet adapter, what came out wasn't medicinal oxygen flow. It was a jet of compressed gas with enough pressure to cut. It wasn't going to hurt the werewolf permanently, but it was going to hit hard across the snout, the eyes, the most sensitive tissue on the face. It was going to create a window. I explained it to Patty in 12 words. She understood and went to disconnect the patient from the portable tank and reconnect her to the wall cylinder, which had enough pressure for hours. Doug heard half of it and filled in the rest on his own. Outside, the werewolf had stopped testing the frame. It stood motionless in the hallway for about 3 minutes that felt longer than they were, then moved away from the door and out of sight down the south hallway. The hallway went empty. I didn't let myself be fooled by that. "We go now," I said. "While it's not at the door." We went out in a line. Doug in front with the large flashlight, me behind with the portable tank and the regulator removed, Patty and Cora with the patients in the middle. Henning last, guiding the woman in the wheelchair. We moved down the central hallway toward the north hallway, which led to the fire escape window. Fast, not running, because running with patients who can barely stand isn't running, it's falling. The fire escape access window was at the end of the north hallway. I knew the external grating had been bent by the werewolf, which meant the structure was compromised but still attached. Doug got there first, assessed the window for 2 seconds and hit the latch with his elbow. The window swung outward. The cold came in like a wall, -4 outside, wind with horizontal snow that killed Doug's flashlight in the first second. I heard the werewolf in the south hallway before I saw it. It was that heavy tread I already knew by memory. 4, 5 impacts, each one closer. Doug started passing people through the window. Henning lifted the woman out of the wheelchair and handed her through with an efficiency I hadn't expected from him. Patty went. Cora went. The patients went one by one, some of them moaning from the cold, one of them refusing until Henning put a hand on his back and pushed. No violence, no negotiation. When the werewolf appeared at the entrance to the north hallway, I was at the window with the cylinder in my hand and 3 more people still to get through. It stopped at the hallway entrance. The light coming from the open window reached about 6 feet in front of it and showed the silhouette, the shoulders, the curve of the spine, the lowered head. It was looking at a hallway full of people in motion and doing what predators do when prey moves in a group, calculating. Then it started forward. Henning went through the window. 1 more patient. 1 left. The gallbladder man, 62 years old, trying to lift his leg to the window frame and failing because of the pain. The werewolf was 25 feet away. I opened the cylinder regulator. The jet came out with a loud, aggressive sound, louder than I'd expected in the enclosed hallway, and caught its snout at an upward angle I'd miscalculated. I hit more on the right side than straight on. It pulled back. Not the pullback of pain, the pullback of impact and surprise, which is different but has the same practical effect of buying distance. I adjusted the angle and held the jet. It swung its head side to side, eyes shut against the stream, and made that guttural sound that filled the hallway in a way that felt physical. Its claws scraped the linoleum, not advancing, bracing. Doug pulled the gallbladder man through the window from outside. I threw the cylinder toward the werewolf, not to hit it, to occupy the space, and went through the window. The fire escape was covered in snow and part of the grating was still bent, but it held the weight. I went down 3 flights without feeling the cold, which is what adrenaline does, and only on the last step noticed my hands were numb. The group was below, clustered against the building wall that partially blocked the wind. All of them. I counted twice. All of them. We moved away from Bartholomew through the back parking lot, between the snow-covered cars, toward the edge of the property where the pine trees began. It wasn't a destination. It was just putting distance between us and it. Some of the patients were in hospital gowns and slippers. Cora had given her own coat to the oldest patient and was hugging herself. Henning had a phone with a weak signal and was calling the emergency number with his hand cupped around it to block the wind. I stopped in the middle of the parking lot and turned back toward the building. St. Bartholomew was dark, except for the white light coming from the OR3 window up above, the only room that still had its own power. The north hallway window was open and banging against the facade in the wind. There was no visible movement on any floor. The storm kept going. It hadn't let up. Henning said something about rescue, about how long, about hypothermia, and I heard it without processing because I was staring at the building and thinking about Marcus, and about what I was going to say when someone asked me what had happened in there, and about whether there were words that could turn any of it into something a person could hear and believe. I didn't find those words. The wind cut across the left side of my face, and I turned my back to Bartholomew. Outside, it was still winter.